What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video, and we're at the home stretch of Pioneer RCQ season, and we've basically went over a lot of like the top decks in the format, what we're kind of expecting to be good, and some of the other ones that kind of came out of the woodwork, to start the Pioneer season and have maintained that kind of momentum and has, proven that it's just not like a flash in the pan, that it's actually a pretty good metagame pick. So today we're going to take a look back at Mono Black Discard. This is a deck that we kind of looked at towards the beginning of RCQ season, like around the cusp of the start of it, and wasn't really sure how good this deck was going to be in terms of the metagame, where we know that it's basically Izzet Phoenix, we have Rakdos Vampires, and then you kind of have like Amalia, which is pretty good against those decks, but maybe not so good against some of the other decks. Just basically like this 2.5 deck format, and Mono Black has definitely proven that it can hang with some of the big dogs and, have some very good performances. So before we get too deep into the deck, of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, I post a lot of modern, Pioneer, and longer form videos. So if any of that stuff interests you, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Both free, easy ways to support me and my content as we are on the road to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Y'all are crushing it, and I really do appreciate any and all support that I can get. So Mono Black Discard is essentially how it sounds. It's a deck based around getting your opponent to discard cards and kind of limit them on resources to where you can kind of take over the game. So typically, like strategies like this, we'd see, the rack in Modern or 8 rack, where, your opponent is basically using the rack type effects to keep your opponent low on cards and damage them for being low on cards, thanks to your discard spells. So with this deck, the idea is kind of the same. We're going to take a look at the spells first. We're going to kind of go on the curve. So we have Duress, Fatal Push, Thoughtseize as some of your 1-drops in the deck. We know Thoughtseize / Duress are just very powerful discard spells in the format. Duress definitely having its, use cases against the more spell-based decks, but Thoughtseize is just overall probably one of the best discard spells to be playing, between Modern and Pioneer, and maybe even some of the best discard spells of all time. I've said it once in a video, and I will continue to say it again. This is probably the best discard spell to play. Losing a life literally does not matter. It's as dead as any other discard spell, like in the late game, but, in the early game is absolutely one of the most powerful discard spells to be playing, and who cares about the life loss? Fatal Push is one of the more efficient removal spells in the format. When we see decks playing cards like, Shieldred, in our benefit anyway, because we're playing Shieldred, Hostile Investigator, Aclazotz, which we'll go over here in a minute, but, Fatal Push is going to have a hard time touching those creatures, and in a format where we have kind of like Slick Shot aggro, the Boros variants, the Gruul variants, and even like the Mono Red versions, Fatal Push is going to hit all of those creatures. It's going to hit Amalia, it's going to hit the Wild Growth Walker, and a lot of the other important creatures in the Amalia deck, on top of some of the other threats in like the Vampires and the Izzet Phoenix deck. So Fatal Push is just overall a very good, very efficient removal spell that from time to time you're going to be able to upgrade it to dealing with 4 cost or less things, which means that then you can also hit opposing Shieldreds, Hostile Investigators, even hitting things, a little bit bigger like the 3 and 4 mana cards in the in some of the Amalia decks and stuff like that, and even getting up to like Preacher of the Schism and like the Rakdos Vampires deck. At 2 mana, we're looking at a Go for the Throat, a Heartless Act, and a Shieldred's Edict. You even have this Mazemind's Tome, which we'll get to here in a minute, and the Namesake card, or I guess rather what should be the Namesake card in Waste Not. So this is, we were talking about threats in the discard decks where, we have the Rack, and then we have like Shrieking Affliction in the modern versions. Waste Not is essentially like our version of that in this deck. Cost 2 mana, it's an enchantment. If your opponent discards a creature card, you make a 2/2 zombie. If they discard a land, you make 2 black mana, and whenever an opponent discards a non-creature, non-land card, draw a card. So this is going to be a way that we can kind of leverage some of these other discard spell effects and just kind of make what we want out of it. We get our opponent to discard creatures. They're not going to be playing creatures. We're going to be getting 2/2 zombies. They decide to discard lands. Guess what? We can follow it up by playing more discard spells, potentially more removal, depending on, what we have available to us at the time. And if they don't discard a creature and they don't discard a land, we're just going to get to draw cards and potentially draw into more discard spells or draw into some win conditions as well to further put pressure on our opponent. Mazemind Tome is kind of interesting because in this slot, you would normally see a card like Reckoner Bankbuster. And for 2 mana, you get an artifact that you can tap to scry 1, and then you can pay 2 and then draw a card. And if there are 4 or more page counters on Maze Mind Tome, you exile it, and if you do, gain 4 life. So my thought is, in the early game, you're going to be able to scry, you're going to potentially get to curve out, find your 3 and 4 drops or whatever. And I think this works out a little bit better than Reckoner Bankbuster for the fact that you have like the Reckoner Bankbuster mode on this card to pay 2 and tap it to draw a card. Technically, you could do this more than, Reckoner Bankbuster. So I guess there's like that kind of going for it if you get to the late game. But in the early game, then you can essentially play this on 2, pass a turn, tap it, scry to look for something like a 3-drop, which we'll kind of get into here in a minute. And then you can untap and then be able to scry before your draw step to actually see, if you can find like a 3-drop to play. Speaking of those 3-drops, we have 4 Go Blank in the deck. Makes a player discard 2 cards and exile cards from that player's graveyard. While I wouldn't say this is like lights out against Amalia, the fact that you just get to hit cards out of their hand and then also exile their graveyard is pretty good if they're maybe leaning more towards like a return to the ranks or what have you, to try to like kind of go off in that way or maybe backdoor into it. You're just going to limit them on resources and you're going to get rid of their graveyard. Of course, this is amazing against like the Is It Phoenix decks who need like a critical mass of cards to kind of get going, and you kind of hit them in that way where you get rid of cards in their hand and then you're also getting rid of their graveyard too, being able to take some Phoenixes out along the way along with cutting them off resources. You also have Liliana the Veil, which is a card like early on, really wasn't seeing a lot of play in the Pioneer format, was bordering on probably not good enough. We saw in the sideboard of some decks, and it's starting to kind of make a comeback, especially in this mono black deck. Liliana, literally +1, each player discards a card. You're going to be able to get triggers off a Waste Not. It's a pretty good removal spell and making your opponent sacrifice a creature. So if you're able to kind of keep off, things like the draw card like Vampire, like Blood Tithe Harvester or whatnot from the Rakdos Vampires deck, this is a way that you could get rid of Vein Ripper without targeting your opponent, and you're not going to lose any life. And of course, it's on them to kind of put pressure on the Liliana, because then from that point on, it's going to make your opponent discard a card every turn while you're getting to kind of use your mana effectively the way that you want to then get more cards out of your opponent's hand. So definitely ends up being a pretty big threat, and where the -2 is probably beneficial for this deck more than the -1. Kind of reason why we see like the Shielder's Edict as well as like a way to kind of get around it. Having these edict effects kind of makes it a lot easier for us to beat cards like Vein Ripper, because that card's still pretty hard even for a deck like Mono Black Discard. Getting to more of like the threats and like kind of the ways that we're going to actually close out the game a little bit more consistently. We have Hostile Investigator, which was from the Big Score like subset inside of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. 4 mana 4/3 enters battlefield. Target opponent's going to discard a card, and whenever one or more players discards a card, you investigate. This triggers only once each turn. So you're able to kind of put this into play, and especially if you get multiples of these, you're going to be able to create multiple clues a turn that are then going to convert into more cards as you go on. You're going to continue to hit your land drops, and you're going to be able to crack multiple clues and then play cards like Shieldred or maybe even like Thoughtseize, Waste Not, what have you. Shieldred continuing to be one of the better creatures in the format. While it kind of makes the cut, doesn't make the cut in, I think, Rakdos Vampires from time to time where they want to be a little bit more aggressive. Shieldred is definitely a card that sits on the battlefield. It's going to protect your life total very well. It's going to end up dinging your opponent every time they're going to draw cards. If they don't have an immediate answer for it, they're going to have to keep digging, which means they're going to have to draw more cards. You're going to end up losing more life, and you're going to be able to put pressure on them with the Shieldred as well once you kind of clear the path for her to start attacking. Of course, you're going to gain a little bit of life as well. It's going to help you against some of those aggressive decks where you're making a ton of clues, maybe with like Maze Mind Tomes and what have you. You're just going to be able to kind of pick up some extra cards and gain a bunch of life as well. There's also one Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. This is more of like a standard card, but it has found its way into the Pioneer version of like these like black, just base black, like mid-range decks. So 5 mana 4/4, flying lifelink. Whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card, and for each opponent who can't, you draw a card. So this is going to help you get some card advantage if your opponent is empty-handed. So it's not completely dead. It's not making your opponent just discard a card. But even if it does, when you have things like Waste Not in play, this is also going to help you. But it also has like the added text of whenever an opponent discards a land card, you get to create a 1/1 bat creature token with flying. So this will kind of help you, again, continue to put pressure on your opponent if they're just trying to like hold cards or whatever. Maybe they're trying to get you with like a with like a Thoughtseize or whatnot, so you're going to end up missing on that. Your opponent is going to get punished for it. So they're either going to discard a non-land card, or they're going to end up discarding a land, and you're going to end up getting bats for your troubles. And then if your opponent manages to kill this creature, it returns to the battlefield trapped and transformed under its owner's control. And then, you get to tap it for a black mana and then pay 2 and a black and then transform it back into Aclazotz, but you can only activate it if a player has 1 or fewer cards in hand and only as a sorcery. But with the nature of this deck, pretty reliably, you're going to get your opponent down to 1 or less cards, and even if your opponent manages to kind of hold multiple cards in hand, you're going to end up like kind of using as many of your resources as possible, so you're able to flip Temple of the Dead yourself, and again, continue to put pressure on your opponent to keep answering the Aclazotz and find more permanent ways of actually dealing with the Aclazotz. Mana base, you are looking at like Castle Lochthwain is like a way to draw extra cards. Again, when you have like 0 or 1 cards in hand, and then you're going to essentially get to pay 4 mana to draw a card and like lose 1 or 2 life, is going to be pretty good for you. And again, like every kind of card matters in this matchup where you are playing a lot of discard spells and you're playing a lot of removal. You're going to get to a point where those cards really aren't that good. So Castle Lochthwain is like a way that, you're going to see multiple cards a turn to try and find cards that are impactful, like your creatures or maybe a Liliana of the Veil. Because at least in that, like if you can get to the ultimate and you're pretty good at splitting piles, you're going to absolutely set your opponent back super far and kind of force them into some pretty bad situations. We have Demolition Field as a 1/of, for Field of Ruin. We have Gyre Reach Sanitarium. And while these are kind of like a lot of like colorless lands, we are playing the card Sunken Citadel, which makes you choose a color. You're always going to choose black. And then you can add 2 mana of the chosen color and spend to activate abilities of land sources. So this means that we get to activate cards like Hive of the Eye Tyrant for a little bit of a discount, Gyre Reach Sanitarium, Field of Ruin, and Demolition Field, all just off of a single Sunken Citadel, which is honestly pretty awesome. And then you have Takenuma that as well kind of gets discounted from Sunken Citadel because it is an activated ability of a land. So you do kind of get a discount for Takenuma, as well as some of your other legendary creatures can make that a little bit cheaper. Sideboard, looking at cut down. We have more Duresses, Feed the Swarm, can destroy a creature enchantment, and then you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. You have Reckoner, Bankbuster. If you need to be more of a mid-range deck, you have Unlicensed Hearse, so it can mess with the graveyard. Same with Ashiok, plus getting to shut off things like Court of Calling effects on your opponent's stuff. Path of Peril easily sweeps up some of the small creatures. I don't think I guess technically you could cleave it, but this is just to kind of clean up some of those small creature decks. Extinction Event, believe like against like mono green, this ends up being pretty good. Like you name Odd and you just get to like exile all of their things, and they just kind of get set back because a lot of their stuff or all their stuff cares about dying. And then 2, Invoke Despair. This is a card that we have not seen for a while, and this card was like a house when it was first released in Standard and was pretty good in Pioneer as well, from what I understand, or at least what I can remember. And this is also like got to be pretty good too. Like your opponent's got to sacrifice a creature. If they can't, you lose 2 life and draw a card, and you repeat the process for an enchantment or planeswalker. So you're either gonna pay 5 mana and make them sack each of their creature, enchantment, and planeswalker, or sometimes it just ends up being a burn spell for 5 mana where they lose 6 life and you draw 3 cards. Like that is still pretty good. Given the fact that there's not much they're going to be able to do. And of course, if you pair this with like Shieldred, you end up gaining 2 life as well. So I mean, like kind of like a mini Cruel Ultimatum if you have a Shieldred in play, while not actually being Cruel Ultimatum. So that is the Mono Black discard deck for the Pioneer format. This is a deck that, again, I think maybe I was a little bit skeptical of when we first kind of looked at it. I think it was a deck that people have always tried to play, in Modern. People are trying to make it something in Pioneer. And I think the conditions are just right for this deck to actually be a very solid metagame choice. Kind of like Amalia in a way where it just kind of does a lot of things right to kind of see play. Where you are able to mess with some of the more dedicated graveyard decks with just main deck go blanks, on top of just, again, like putting them low on just natural resources that they can't really get back Phoenixes or really abuse their graveyard too much. If you're able to kind of like, in Phoenix's case, keep them off of something like Treasure Cruise, and you're able to kind of keep them low on like cantrips, you know, you're not going to have very many targets for like their removal spells. So those cards are just going to kind of sit in their hand while you kind of eat at their cantrips. You have a lot of good removal options for Rakdos vampires. You have some pretty good removal options as well for kind of like Amalia and those kind of creature decks. And again, you can kind of attack them on both axes, where you can kind of, you know, keep them off resources, then also like keep them off of like the graveyard as well, which I think is like a winning strategy, because if you try to do one or the other, you kind of get burned by the other. So, you know, overall, pretty sweet deck. Honestly, looks like a lot of fun to actually play. And if you can get past, you know, some amount of games where you're going to be playing against control and you're going to want to draw discard spells, draw removal, whatever, and vice versa, you know, things are going to happen. But, you know, overall, like, I think this deck is pretty consistent. You know, doesn't have any other problems that other decks normally have in terms of like drawing kind of like the wrong half of their deck and whatnot. But yeah, overall, pretty sweet deck. Definitely worth playing if you are trying to have a little bit of fun as we kind of close out the Pioneer RCQ season. But that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there is another Pioneer deck that you would like to see before we get to the end of Pioneer RCQ season. Of course, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, as they are free, easy ways to support me and my content. Again, as we try to get to 1K subscribers by the end of the year. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.